Good morning, noon, or night, wherever and whenever you are listening to The Shift. I am your host, Doug McKenty. This is The Shift, episode 11. It's recorded on August 31st, 2017. If you like what you're hearing, please think about becoming a patron of The Shift. That's patreon.com/The Shift. If you want to learn more about what's going on here, check out my Facebook page at The Shift with Doug McKenty. If you want to join the conversation, you can catch me on Twitter at DMcKenty, and for archives and other stuff that's going on here at The Shift, check me out at www.theshiftnow.com. My guest on the program today is Danny Haiphong. Danny is a Vietnamese American activist and journalist whose work has been showcased on the prominent African American public affairs journal, The Black Agenda Report. I have followed BAR for some time and have been particularly impressed with its penchant for transcending the left-right paradigm and getting to the real truth behind racial, economic, and political oppression in the United States today. The Black Agenda Report has become my go-to source for information and perspectives from the African American community from an independent point of view. In the wake of the Charlottesville violence and the steady rise of racial tensions in the U.S., I looked to the Black Agenda Report for answers to some of the many questions I had about race relations. A few articles by Danny Haiphong really stood out. Charlottesville in America, the myth of the white supremacist tidal wave, Boston protest of white supremacy and fascism revealed deep contradictions of the Trump era, and Washington, a one-party state, are just a few of the articles that reveal the depth and complexity of race relations in the U.S. landscape. I am happy to discuss this today with Danny Haiphong. Welcome to the program, and thanks for helping to make the shift. How's it going?
It's going good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. I've really enjoyed your articles. I love getting the Black Agenda Report, and especially after everything that's been going on with Charlottesville and the rise of the alt-right lately, it's been nice to get that perspective. Do you want to give us a little bit more about your history and how you got involved with writing for BAR?
Yeah, sure. So I followed Black Agenda Report a lot beginning in 2011 during the US NATO invasion of Libya. I was actually in New York City at the time doing a semester for a labor union, and Occupy Wall Street was going on. And all throughout CNN and the various corporate media outlets, there was this question of Libya going around. Libya, the Gaddafi dictatorship, the slaughter of Libyans, the genocide of that government. And it was really my first taste of a US-led war being waged in a period where I had the ability to do some alternative research, and Black Agenda Report became really my go-to to understanding international affairs, and it ended up really helping frame my analysis both on what's going on domestically in the United States and in the international arena. So when I found out that the Obama administration and the U.S. government as a whole was very wholly complicit in leading the charge to destroy an African country with the first so-called black president being in office, that really started to make me question a whole lot of things and made me want to go beyond what Occupy Wall Street was doing, which was very commendable at the time, which was, fighting the 1% and calling out for the needs of the 99%, but really ignoring questions of U.S. foreign policy. And so Black Agenda Report became a real inspirational tool for me to understand what's going on around the world. So after I graduated from college, I decided that I wanted to see if I could write for them, because my politics had by that time developed along the lines of what they were writing about. So that's really how I got involved, and it took a little bit for me to to really learn how to write and to be able to contribute to them with any sort of consistency.
Well, it's been a great job. I've really appreciated the articles that I've read from your perspective. The article I just read last night about Washington being a one-party state, I think really hit the nail on the head. And that's the other thing that I really like about the Black Agenda Report too, is they're not falling in line with what I kind of typically refer to as the left-right paradigm, that you're supposed to sort of choose sides and decide what you're going to do. They seem to do a really good job of seeing through the corruption that seems endemic in certainly both parties. Do you want to speak to what you've seen, maybe a little bit about what you wrote in that article about how the two-party system works? Really seems to be two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, I think that especially in this period where we're going through this era of Trump, and there's a lot of emotional and very legitimate political opposition to Donald Trump on a whole lot of levels. It's really important to understand that what really brought us here were policies and sort of power play moves made by both parties that have delegitimized them in the eyes of the majority of people in the United States. Whether we can see that on an organized level is, I think, a question. But definitely what we saw throughout the 2016 elections reflected the legitimate sentiments of a lot of people in the United States who are sick of things like endless austerity here in the United States, where people cannot afford health care, people can't afford housing, jobs are difficult to come by, and when you do come by them, they pay low wages. These problems, along with police brutality, the racism that's built into the very fabric of the U.S. state, not just these bands of white supremacists that are merely reflecting ideas that emanate from that state. I think all of these things put together, including the trillions of dollars that the U.S. spends on wars abroad, has really, I think, educated a lot of people into this disillusionment with the two-party system. And in my opinion, what all of these issues reflect is the fact that, in fact, the two-party corporate duopoly in the United States really works for one class, and that's the ruling class, the 1%, as Occupy Wall Street called it, but really the owners of capital who dictate politics in the United States and dictate them in their interests.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, the other thing that really kind of stood out to me from your work was the consistency that you have in calling out the U.S. as a colonizer or as an empire, because I don't think a lot of people are willing to go into that discussion yet. I don't even see a political discussion happening that doesn't recognize that. Like, if you're ignorant of this, I mean, it's almost the way the American propaganda really works. Like in the invasion of Libya, they come out and they say, "Oh, we're," or what's going on in what's been going on in Syria after that.
Mm,
We're here to protect the the responsibility to protect the poor people of Libya or the poor people of Syria, but really they've got this colonizing agenda behind it. So I mean, if you don't call it what it is, you're not getting anywhere, right?
exactly. And I think that's a big problem here in the United States in terms of building a real political movement to transform these decrepit conditions that we face here in the United States. The big problem is that oftentimes our political movements either ignore or align with the very class of people that are leading these wars abroad. And
Mm-hmm.
it's unfortunate because a lot of what calls themselves the left in the United States were behind in cheering on the destruction of Libya, are hesitant and still are hesitant to lend support to the Syrian people, to call out their government for spending, billions upon billions of dollars destroying other countries in order to cement U.S. Hegemony around the world, which really is just the hegemony of corporations. It has no benefit to most people here in the United States other than the very rich. I mean, if we were to ask anybody what did the destruction of Libya do to benefit them here in the United States, they wouldn't be able to tell you, right?
Right.
All we can see here is the privatization of education and the fact that most people are making less than $30,000 a year. Those are the things that are mattering to us day to day. But
Yeah.
if we're not able to see that connection to what's going on around the world, we're isolating ourselves in a big way.
I saw this graph the other day that really said it all. I posted it on the Shifts Facebook page, but it was about 1975. Up from before 1975, you see a correlation between productivity gains and worker income. And there, so, as the economy became more productive, the workers were granted a higher standard of living. Right at about 1975, suddenly worker wages flatlined and productivity continues to go up in this graph. And you can just see that, like, okay, what's happening now? The
Hmm.
American worker is getting left behind, obviously. And I think there's going to come a breaking point. I mean, there's just a matter of time before the people have had enough. And you've seen it. You know, they've gone back and forth in the last 12 years or so, voting Republican, then voting Democrat, then voting Republican, and neither party is actually accomplishing anything for the people on the ground that are that are really, you know, trying to scrape by, really trying to get by without completely getting lost in this quagmire of debt slavery. So what do
Hmm.
you see as a like the necessity of a political movement? You know, one of the things that I'm trying to do with this show anyway is to get people off of the left right paradigm so that they can start to organize on a level where we're all starting to work together. You know, I'm seeing so many political
Mm,
philosophies that are so divisive. And I think people love to fight each other, but I think that actually the 1% or even the 0.01%, you know, the very, very wealthy, they use these natural divisions, race being one of them, as a form of a divide and conquer technique. So we can never just get together, get on the same page, and realize that there's 350 million of us and a handful of them. You know, why don't we make some
yeah,
changes here?
yeah, yeah. Definitely. I mean, for me, what I think, and from my experiences in the movement, not just as a writer, but also, just what I've seen here in Boston, I think fighting that political sectarianism is a big thing. And I think what is really lacking, I'm actually writing about it now, is
Hmm.
the idea of class and class analysis as being what I think as the breaking point to open up the political discussion among the people. I think what we're seeing right now is just such an utter, utterly large level of political confusion
Hmm.
among working people and poor people in this country that it has really been facilitated by, as you said, right, these decades and decades of economic stagnation, crisis, which has led to, um, an intense political assault, an intense assault by the state on people's civil liberties, an intensification of things like mass incarceration, right? All of
Hmm.
these new conditions that have all come together in the last 30 years to produce what I think is sort of the dead end of the system, right? All we're going to get is more institutional racism, more economic crisis if it's left up to the 1%. And for us, I think what we need to do is start focusing on political education in our organizing efforts. I think that there is a huge lag with with the political ideology of our movements that is not reflected that is just not reflected in the political activity here in the United States. We don't all of the movements either end up in a Democratic Party graveyard or they end up unable to chart a path forward because just the political consciousness on the ground is at such a low level. So I think we really
Right.
need to focus on political education at this point because there is going to be that tipping point, that breaking point. There always is. There's always an economic crisis. A political crisis is kind of in front of us right now. We're experiencing it right now, and a lot of people are not organized to understand that. And I think our focus needs to be on politically educating our class, the working class, the poor, to be able to fight this and understand what's going on in this world so we can change it.
Let's talk a little bit about, I mean, you know, since I really kind of wanted to focus on Charlottesville, let's talk a little bit about race relations and what is going on there, because you make the distinction between what's catching the headlines right now, which is this apparent rise in white nationalism or white supremacy, versus you know, the systemic violence that I actually see, and I think you do too, as the real culprit here. Like, we're not. I'd like to see, well, I mean, I also think a lot of poor whites are in the same boat, and so I have a little bit of an issue with even dividing it up by race so much, because I think it's mostly a class issue, and talking about it in terms of class and getting all races together to, you know, realize that we're at least to some extent in the same boat is part of the solution from my point of view. But I do understand that within the system there is racial bias. I mean, we've seen such a high percentage of African Americans in in the prison system, which is a huge problem, and also just the ghettoization of certain neighborhoods. I think this has all been done purposefully by a kind of an institutionalized racism. And these are the issues that I wish that we could talk about more directly. So, what do you see is going on? Why do you see all of this focus on the white nationalism, the white supremacy angle, and so little talk about the systemic issues that really would be the long-term solutions?
Yeah, yeah, it's a big question. There's a lot to it. It's definitely multi-layered as to why we find ourselves at a moment where there is this apparent rise in racist ideas being able to fester out in the open. And of course, that's a really hard thing to measure. And
Mm-hmm.
so, we could hear from any number of sources that sure, this is on the rise. But one could make the argument that this level that that racism and systemic violence in this country has been on the rise for decades. From a policy perspective, but also from an ideological perspective. When economic times are hard, things like racism become even more intense because it is one of the strongest weapons in the hands of the oppressor to keep all oppressed classes in their place. And I think we have to understand that this idea of the white race was really created to not only divide, but to ascribe quote unquote privileges to the white poor
Mm-hmm.
that kept them also in a state of perpetual oppression, and allowed them to feel like they had a place higher than another group of people, and were often used as cannon fodder for
Right.
wars, slave catching, these kind of things. So, sure, yes, material benefits are there, but also there is this deep need to approach the question of racism with nuance and with the idea that this doesn't come, even if the white poor are involved and complicit in racist activities and actions, it doesn't come from the white. They didn't create the system. Who creates the system is the dominant class.
Right.
And so I think that what got us here is a big question. I think that you know, beginning in the 1970s, capitalism became the capitalist system became a high tech superpower led by the United States. And as technology has grown, we've seen massive levels of unemployment continue to rise. The economic crises are harder and harder to get out of, and the majority of people do not get out of them. So right now we're in a situation where we could say that half of the country is living in a state of poverty.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we could, I don't think the United States has really been in that position before. And then we have the fact that with under those economic conditions, the state has had to become even more repressive and has had to intensify all of these racist and white supremacist institutional policies. It's had to create a mass incarceration state in order to put unemployed Black Americans somewhere. And that's where the ruling class has decided that they should go, is
Sure.
in prison. That's a lot of surplus labor goes into the prisons. But also the message of mass incarceration and police brutality is also one that basically says that any radical ideas and any revolutionary ideas that you have is at risk of being punitively, dealt with. And I think that we have to also understand it from that perspective, that police brutality, mass incarceration, political prisoners, all of these different questions that have really taken on grand significance in the last 30 years is also about political repression and oppressing ideas of movements of the past that the ruling class desperately needs to keep away from the growing misery of the masses, especially Black people. So there's
Mm-hmm.
a lot to it. And then when we add in the US empire being a global superpower that is now competing with countries like China and Russia for hegemony,
Mm-hmm.
then we have a situation where the stakes are even higher, where the ruling system, the imperial system requires an even greater level of of distorted consciousness and political repression in order to justify wars abroad that are not going to end unless the system ends. So we have all of these different factors that have led to this moment where there's such a low level of political consciousness on the ground that when something like a Donald Trump happens,
Mm-hmm.
there is this, there's two sides, I think, two levels of opposition that has arisen. There's the opposition on the independent political left in this country, which has targeted Donald Trump as a racist, a sexist, a bigot, all those things which are true and which are totally legitimate. And then there's the opposition from the ruling class, which sees Donald Trump as anathema to the stability of U.S. imperialism. So
Right.
they don't like Trump for his positions on Russia. They don't like Trump for his isolationist economic positions. And they also think that he's just a blemish on the PR image of the system as a whole. So we have these two oppositions that have arisen, and both of them are aligned in fighting over racism in order to achieve their very different agendas. But it's also unfortunate that they have aligned in a way where other questions have kind of fallen to the wayside, like these institutional questions of white supremacy and empire
Mm-hmm.
that I think are critical to fighting the rise of fascism. I think if you're worried about fascism, you have to be worried about empire and institutional white supremacy.
Right. Well, I love the idea that this system right now, I mean, this is my interpretation of history is that basically the system right now it's essentially feudalism. There's a lineage of corporate colonialism that goes back for 500 years, and this is the same system. Like almost as if the American Revolution was more like a hiccup,
Mm,
and then the colonial powers were able to gain control. Probably in my opinion, somewhere around the Civil War, and they just regained control in the same corporate system, the East India Corporation, basically that controlled the United States before the American Revolution. I mean, the Cargill Corporation, British Petroleum, these are still owned by the Queen of England, right? I
mm,
mean,
mm,
so I actually see a very similar lineage, and I like to analyze world events from this perspective of colonialism because I think that people get off track, and I think that a lot of times these ideas are co-opted by the elite class. Like I mean, this the way that you're describing, people on the left don't like Trump and the elite class don't like Trump for different reasons. I think my concern is that the elite, I've felt almost like, Trump has these bad characteristics, the tendency towards misogyny, a lack of compassion for people of color. I mean, there's no question about that. But then all of a sudden, and this is where I really like the depth of your analysis, I think the elite have jumped on that and then blown it almost so far out of proportion as to create this race war, basically to make sure that Trump stays in line with some of these other things, like fighting Russia, because he was
mm,
talking about trying to normalize relations with Russia. You've also simultaneously got this meme about Russia hacked the elections, Russia's on Trump's side, which has gotten, interestingly, what I've seen in the last 6 months, I've seen a lot of people on the left become convinced that now they're warmongers, basically. I mean, typically anti-war people are now so convinced that Russia hacked the election that they're ready for war with Russia, and you're like, how did this happen?
Yeah, it, yeah. I mean, it's been a huge frustration for me in the last year plus since the 2016 elections really kicked off and immediately began to show the cracks and the fault lines that are really growing here in the United States. This question of what to do about Donald J. Trump and his millions of supporters who supported him for a whole host of reasons. And
Hmm.
of course, we can acknowledge the pervasiveness of white supremacy and the pervasiveness of racism in the ideological sense, and understand why, poor middle class whites would embrace someone who could both speak to economic concerns as well as their maybe misconceived racist ideas. We can understand that, but I think the danger of not acknowledging some of the broader significant, broader conditions and the significance of what's really happening here becomes, I think, a bigger problem for us, because, as you said, Donald Trump is not a likable person, a billionaire, of the enemy class.
Hmm.
He's not someone who's on our side. But if we can understand the significance of his presidency as more about the crisis of the system as a whole, and more about how, in order for Donald Trump to even stake out an oppositional position to the two-party corporate duopoly, which is what he had to do to win. He couldn't win the Republican Party primary by just agreeing with GOP orthodoxy.
Right.
He had to stake on independent, and in doing so, he had to take positions that traditionally, and I think necessarily, have been radical anti-war left positions, like
Hmm.
regime change, um, and easing relations with countries that um, ultimately hold a large stake in what goes on in both the world's capitalist economy, but also in the geopolitical sense, where a conflict with these two countries, with the U.S., Russia, and China, would be nuclear
Right.
in significance, which means that the whole lot of humanity has an interest in not having that happen, which means, regardless of what we feel about Donald Trump, we need to be analyzing and discussing and raising these points as things that we need to embrace on a political level on the grassroots. So it's a complicated question that, honestly, in my experience, no one has really gotten, other than a few individuals here and there. But at the
Hmm.
organizational level, it that kind of analysis is not there. There's a lot of fear. Well, if we say that those things aren't all that bad, then we'll isolate a lot of people who think he's really racist. And I think that it's a mistake, because we uh, I, I think we're at a moment where millions of people can understand how the system of imperialism, the system of capitalism, the system of colonialism, as you put it, um, operates on a structural level, on a level of class, on a level of uh, the state operating to achieve the interests of one group over another. We can start to have these conversations because of the conditions that people are experiencing on the ground. It's a mistake to ignore some of these broader questions in order to attack something that is debatable as being an immediate task, which is the immediate task of smashing white supremacists, right? It's
Hmm.
debatable, I think, but whether that's the immediate task. A task, sure. The
Right.
immediate task, the task we should focus on solely, it's not going to put food on the table, and it's not going to stop World War III.
Well, yeah, right. And I think that's the interesting thing is that I think that people voted for Trump because he was different. I mean, he at least he was a populist. He at least his rhetoric was populist. It may not have been progressive, but at least it wasn't part of the system. And I do think people would have voted for Bernie if the DNC hadn't, according to my information, rigged that primary so that Bernie could have won because people were looking for a difference. I mean, as much as the narrative wants to be that people voted for Trump because half of America is super racist, I actually think that most people voted for Trump probably just to vote against Hillary because Hillary was way too much of that political class. And, the people are, like you're describing, millions of people are actually waking up to what's going on, to the fact that this two-party system is really a one-party system that's controlled by a handful of elite people. And so it was in this frustration that people voted for Trump. I'm not trying to say I'm a Trump supporter by any means. I almost hate that I find myself being this kind of
Yeah.
devil's advocate sometimes.
Yeah.
I just think that, where you're coming from is somehow we've gotten lost in this let's hate Trump because he's a racist. And then look at all these racists that are coming out of the woodwork, when it's like, well, there always have been, these KKK guys sitting around. And I'm not, it's not that we shouldn't be convincing them to change their ways, because, it is a serious problem, but somehow we're not actually addressing the real institutional issues that are the problem. And we're not going to come to any kind of long-term solutions so long as, the issue is Confederate statues and white supremacists.
Exactly. And when there was a real organized movement 5 decades ago for, against white supremacist violence, it was on an organized basis. It met force with force, but the organizations didn't make confronting that force the only task. Let's say the Black Panther Party didn't make defending the Black community from police violence and white terrorist violence the only task, right? The Black Panther Party made the immediate needs of the Black community the primary task, which is the right to live and the right to healthcare, the right to, affordable food, housing, and as well as the right to be able to determine your own destiny, free from being sent off to be a mercenary for the war machine, right? So these were all immediate. Those were the immediate tasks. It was a broad program, and I think we have to start thinking like that again, because we are in a dangerous moment. I think a dangerous moment where the ruling class and its system of capitalism, colonialism, imperialism is in such a state of crisis. It cannot reverse the trend that it is on. It cannot get off of this runaway train.
Mm-hmm.
We have a moment where demands for things like single payer health care that is supported by the majority of people in this country will never make it to the table, because both parties know that that is off the table for who controls them, for the big health insurance companies, the big pharmaceutical companies, and we could go on and on and on, from the military contractors that rely on police militarization and war abroad, and on and on. These things are off the table because to even demand a reform to these things means eating at the profits of the 1%, and that's off the table. So we have to start thinking in a way that will get us to a point where we can start confronting those issues. Where I'm not saying don't confront white supremacists in the streets should they get violent. But if we're only doing that, if we're not talking about these larger problems, we're not, the poor and working class people of all racial identities will not be listening for very long. We have to start thinking about what is going to change the trajectory of the future of humanity as a whole, and it means targeting the entire state apparatus and the two parties that may be interested in taking down Confederate statues and cleaning up its image, but is not interested in really transforming the lives of working class and poor people.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up the Affordable Care Act as just a perfect example where, I mean, the idea of doing that comes out of this conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, somehow gets picked up by the Democratic Party as a liberal concept and is promoted so that then the Republicans hate it because it's so left wing. But really, the whole time, it was the corporate pharmaceutical companies that put it together, and the insurance companies. And they love it. It forces people to buy their product,
Devastating impact, too. I mean, it's had a devastating impact on employer health insurance,
Yeah.
on I work in the healthcare field, and there's these accountable care organizations sprouting up everywhere, which is a fancy term for monopoly, cutting off services, squelching people into these networks in order to save money, and raise costs as well. It's had a devastating impact. It's tiered the system to the point where everyone now is reliant upon corporate private healthcare. I mean, it's a genius move on the part of the ruling class that is trying to cement this notion that healthcare should be for profit, right? It's universalized the for profit system rather than
Mhm.
universalized healthcare.
Yeah.
That's really what it's done, and this has been a trend for every we can look across the spectrum at all of the various sectors of society and the problems that we're dealing with. And we see this rightward lurch of both parties occurring to the point where, in order for the Republican Party to even exist now, um, they have to oppose policies that are directly in their interests. And I think that's why we saw this recent health care bill that the Trump and the GOP proposed um, fail miserably. It was because their bill had to go so far to the right that in the end, um, the bourgeoisie basically settled that the Affordable Care Act was going to live another day. But this is going to happen with everything,
Yeah.
and it has happened at education the same way, right? Public education dismantled under the Obama administration to the point where it barely exists.
Hmm.
And here you have people like Betsy DeVos come in who wants to bring back the voucher system, an old system that segregates on a level, on a very direct level, racially. A policy that's been proven to do that in the years past. And so we have these old arguments coming up because both parties honestly agree upon getting rid of public education. But what form it happens, that's what they're going to be debating
Hmm.
from now until there's a movement strong enough to say, no, we don't want one form versus the other. We don't want worse and worse 2.0. We want something better and completely different.
Well, where do you think that the mainstream media falls in on all of this? Because I know, like Black Agenda Report, independent media. I mean, that's kind of where what I've been advocating with this program is just to get people away from corporate media, whether even left or right. Independent media, more often than not, typically agree, because 90% of what's going on out there is based on this colonialism or this corporatocracy or this level of corruption, this giant racket that everybody can see is going on, and it's basically enforced by a corrupted Congress. And the mainstream media is just not even letting us have a real conversation about it. I mean, you talk about political education. How do you do that when the mainstream media is not letting you, they don't let so many points of view on the mainstream media? Somehow we've got to get people really listening to alternative perspectives.
Exactly. It's a really difficult struggle, as you are well aware. I mean, we have such a deeply consolidated corporate media that is at war with any alternative ideas in order to maintain some semblance of stability in the face of crises everywhere, domestically and internationally. And you probably remember right around, was it um, was it right after the Trump administration was inaugurated, or was it before that? I don't remember. But the Washington Post basically supported the shady website called Prop or Not. That
Yeah, absolutely.
basically, I don't remember the time period anymore, but I remember Black Agenda Report was on
Yeah.
it, but it
Oh,
was a
right.
mix. It was a mix of a whole lot of different perspectives, all following from the libertarian point of view to the
Yep.
radical left point of view. But every single website was on it, and it's very shady as to what it was most likely. It was most likely a government sponsored site,
It seems that way, right? Yeah.
and so we have that along with this notion of fake news, which Trump didn't create, but actually the Obama administration created that term in order to delegitimize both the ideology of Trump, but also the fact that people online have been expressing all these different opinions, and a lot of them have been left wing. So in order to really Trump, the attack on Trump from the ruling class really has at its core this desire to squash any alternative ideas, whether they be radical left or libertarian, right wing, whatever we want to say they are, anything that strikes at the heart of the corporate ruling class is off the table.
Yeah.
And so all of that together in the immediate sense, coupled onto the fact that the corporate media is really all that most people ingest, we have our work cut out for us. And I think political education definitely has to be a focus, but doing that in a concrete way, beginning to create these alternative media structures that engage people collectively, that give people some power to say what they're thinking about the period, give them the ability to communicate their ideas. And I think organizations have to start taking this up, because it's great for us to be doing this so we can spur and inspire people to take up those tasks. But we really have to do it in an organized manner. I've never seen a revolutionary or radical movement in the history succeed without media. You have to be able to get your message across to people, and we can't rely on the corporate media to do that for us, because it will be on the opposite end, doing everything it can to make sure we can't do our work. So
yeah, it's pretty phenomenal. I had a friend that I was trying to turn on to some independent sites, and I was saying, I've been listening to I've been trusting, because I think it comes down to who you trust in terms of news sites. A lot of times, I mean, unless you're pretty intrepid about reading and then checking sources. I mean, I'm kind of like that. I'm sure you're kind of like that too. People who are into it are really doing that work, but most people, they want to trust the New York Times, or they want to trust the Washington Post, because they've been told over and over again, oh, these are the trusted names in the news, CNN or whatever. But yeah, my friend, I would say, you should try this source or that source. And he goes, oh no, that's on prop or not. It's just Russian propaganda. And I had to say, I
oh
was like,
no.
do you have some evidence to back that up? And it was like, I couldn't get through, so I don't know. The only way I describe it is a certain amount of brainwashing that happens to people that really want to trust the American system. I mean, you've been taught your whole life that, oh, this is the freest country in the world. We've got the Bill of Rights. And, even though you really analyze the Bill of Rights, how many of those do the government actually follow,
Yeah,
But
exactly.
but people are convinced of it. They're convinced that the Russians are the bad guys. They're convinced that Bashar Assad is some kind of butcher and dictator, even though he won an election with the UN inspectors, sitting there saying, wow, it's a miracle. They did such a great job. Um, so
Yeah.
it's phenomenal. Like, I think this is something that a lot of Americans don't really understand, is that when we talk about the 1%, and I really even I definitely prefer to talk about that like 0.01%, because I think you mentioned in one of your articles, the 6 billionaires, 8 billionaires that control half the world's wealth right now. I mean, the number has gotten ridiculous. There literally are a handful of people. I had one person I interviewed said maybe 40 billionaires pretty much control the American government, 40 of the richest people in the United States. And that's just how it works. And Americans, like, they can't wrap their minds around that level of corruption, and they don't want to believe it. And they think that if it was that corrupt, it would be in the Washington Post or the New York Times.
Even if those same billionaires are the ones who control those very institutions,
exactly.
Right? And that is a difficult. It's a difficult thing to parse, because there's just a lot of layers to it, and it's such a systemic problem, right? It gets to the very core of the social relations that we're living on a day-to-day basis, that when there is such a lack of alternative political conversation about these things, it's very easy to attach oneself to the exceptionalist narratives of the United States, which the United States has used throughout its history
Right.
to justify everything from slavery to war to anytime there's an economic crisis or anytime there's job losses and huge losses among working people, it's always like, well, at least we're not that country over there, the Soviet Union. At least we're not China.
Sure.
At least we have this so-called democracy that we can rely on in order to make ourselves feel superior to others. And that's really where racism comes in. And so when we talk about this idea of white supremacist attitudes and ideas, US exceptionalism, which both parties agree upon, is the most racist idea. It's the founding idea. It's the idea that really kicks us all off. And we have to approach that. We have to confront that with just as much vigor as the so-called free speech advocate or the Klanner.
Right.
It really is this idea of a superior nation over all over nations, which clouds our political judgment and clouds our political consciousness. It makes us feel superior to people all over the world, which leads to dangerous things.
It's literally the United States foreign policy is US exceptionalism. And then we have another, I mean, literally our policy is full spectrum dominance over those countries that don't understand US exceptionalism. It's like, you can't go around the world and treat people like that, I mean, what do you expect is going to happen?
Exactly. And so we have this dangerous confrontation. I think
Yeah.
probably the biggest task, maybe the most immediate task that we can all start to work on is stopping or pressuring the US government, if that means sowing divisions in there or whatever it takes, to cease the ruling class or the section of the ruling class that is so bent on provoking Russia and China into a great confrontation. That may be,
Mm-hmm.
in my opinion, the biggest task right now. And that includes beating back these white supremacist attitudes, these American exceptionalist attitudes of, well, China is this or that, and Russia is this or that, Putin's a dictator, and China is a communist, whatever.
Right.
Really starting to investigate what's going on in those countries, but also what's the significance of what's going on between those countries and around that region that is really fueling this war drive, because
Yeah.
we'll start to see some positive things. Like the world is starting to scream out for independence and sovereignty from the US imperial apparatus and policy, while people in the United States have not gotten to the point where they feel like they can relate to that. And there's a whole lot of varying reasons for it, and we need to start chipping away at those. We need to start
Mm-hmm.
chipping away at those ideas and also those real material conditions that make it so.
I think, I mean, not just around the world that there are so many people that are starting to seek independence from this colonial system. But even here at home, when it comes to racism, I wish people and a lot of what's going on, I'd like to see some of the positive things that have happened. I almost feel like I don't know, like why? I mean, things are better. Race relationships are better in the United States today than they were in 1960. I mean, right? Thank God for Martin Luther King. Like these people made a difference and things have improved. And it is important, I think, for everyone to be able to see that there is progress that's being made, and race relationships certainly challenging for everyone. But just focusing so much on the negative all of the time is maybe to some extent it's just something that I think benefits more of that elite class that we've been talking about again. Have you thought about some of the ways that the elite class, because I've seen this happen a few times, really time and again, where the elite class has this ability to co-opt political movements? So something, I'm not sure that this hasn't happened with Black Lives Matter, unfortunately, but something that starts out as a real grassroots movement, if it starts to gain any actual political momentum, well, then, some big donor comes in, gives them that 20 million or $50 million grant. And then the next thing the original message is not quite as radical or has gotten altered, just enough where it's no longer attacking the root of the problem anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what separates, I think, the period of the Black Liberation Movement,
Mhm.
the movement for Black freedom of the period of a generation ago from today, is that in that period, things like nonprofits and NGOs and these sort of civil service, civic organizations that kind of masquerade as public institutions, but really are just kind of covert organizations of the ruling class in order to influence any political activity that happens on the ground. That was just kind of kicking off. It was present, but it didn't have the same reach as it does now, where you have billionaire capitalists putting in millions of dollars into them in order to shift people's attention and move people in certain directions. The MoveOn.orgs and those kind of organizations, for example.
Right.
We see, I think, in terms of current movements, I think every one of them, whether it was Occupy, whether it's Black Lives Matter, every one of them has confronted this issue, and none of them have been strong enough uh, to really challenge it. And I think that there has been all these splits and divides, especially in the Black Lives Matter movement. I've seen it here in Boston. I've observed it all over the country from various people who have written about it, who have talked to me about it. Right? There's all these divisions that occur when money and patronage enters the equation. So you have a lot of
Right.
genuine activists still trying to do the work, but are clouded and their attention, they're basically ignored. They don't get the attention that, let's say, the DeRay McKessons of the world will get, because um, they're able to gain politically and economically from the ruling class in order to promote a certain type of idea that is much more useful to the system as a whole than, let's say, the genuine activists who are out there who are like, we need to overthrow and change the system completely in order to really um, have any semblance of uh, a way of life that isn't completely uh, infected by racism, right? We're not going to get rid of racism without getting rid of the system.
Right.
So those activists often work in the background and are often poor and and
Well,
can
that's
barely
just
feed
it, right?
themselves.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing because you get into political activism, and if you do it with integrity, then yeah, I mean, there's not a heck of a lot of money in the game, as a community organizer. You also talk about a little bit. I think I read in one of your articles about how even these white nationalist groups have gotten infiltrated. I mean, I'm just thinking of some of the ways that the system does really work to sort of augment some of these problems that aren't necessarily the focus of the problem. I mean, we've seen the FBI infiltrate white nationalist groups and then turn them into something maybe even bigger than they should have ever been. And we've definitely seen the same thing with with domestic terrorism, where the FBI will show up, train somebody, radicalize somebody, train somebody, you get them out there with the bomb, and then arrest them right before they explode the thing, so they can go, look, we've saved the world from domestic terrorism. Um, just another way I think that the system does co-opt, these kinds of movements in order to create division where there is not necessarily division, and divert really probably from the real issues, from the real systemic problems that are out there.
Yeah, I mean, to disconnect white nationalism or white racism, white supremacy from the U.S. government itself is an absolute, uh, I think, a crime in the
Mm-hmm.
political sense, because really, I mean, this has been going on for forever. I mean, we can go back to the earliest days where, the before the United States, white nationalists, you could call them, white supremacists, were organized to be slave catchers. They were paid to be the first police force in this country before there was something called the U.S. nation state. And then we can go on and on and on, from the police forces in the KKK and these institutions during the Jim Crow period, right? There's always been, because the US state is white supremacist in its origins, there's always been this interlocking between this question of white nationalism and U.S. politics and the system as a whole.
Hmm.
And so to think that this isn't going on now, when there's documented evidence that they're infiltrating, quote unquote, these organizations, to think that the U.S. ruling class isn't steering these organizations, isn't fomenting and helping these organizations do what they do in a time of crisis is laughable. They without state support, whether it's through protection, indirect protection, or whether it's through literally helping strengthen these forces, I think they would be even more marginal than they are now.
Right.
And I think we have to start understanding that, because that then gets us to confront the real power players, as scary as it can be, right? Because these are the FBI and the intelligence institutions and on and on and on. These are the real players. This is the class and their protectors who will do anything
Yeah.
to remain in power.
You know
Yeah.
what's funny? A while back, a few years ago, I had this epiphany thinking about the system, because so often we get caught up in our, isms or our ideologies. And at one point, I just kind of thought about it, and I thought, wow, I think the government is just a big gang. It's a big, criminal organized crime syndicate, basically. And it basically, it runs drugs and it runs guns, and it has a protection racket. And so these other gangs, maybe it's the African American gangs or the Hispanic gangs, or these are just competing gangs to the big gang that is the government of the United States. And or the Italian mafia or the Russian mafia or whatever. They're all just sort of competing factions for the same power play. And it was almost like to shed myself of the ideology and the political philosophy behind it all, and just realize, this power play. And that's what's actually happening. And these rich white guys happen to be on top of that pyramid right now,
Yeah.
the ones who were in the most powerful gang starting hundreds of years ago, and
Yeah.
they've got this lineage, and they've gained power, and power is what rules. But it's interesting. I like what you said. One of the quotes that I read from you was, if white nationalism wasn't profitable, then it wouldn't exist. And so you're
Exactly.
seeing like everything really does kind of trickle down from these few rich white guys that control the system. And they're like puppet masters. And I guess, the concern is that the rest of us, we shouldn't be puppets. We've got to somehow wake up and figure out how to gain some political power for ourselves and take the power back for the people, no matter what color you are, from these handful of rich billionaires that seem to have taken over for the rest of us. So we've got maybe 5 minutes left in the show. I just like to kind of end on solutions, and we talked about political activism. Do you see maybe the possibility of a third party forming, or what kind of activism, what kind of organization could this actually could take shape realistically to create a change?
Well, I think that the idea of a third party will probably never really manifest itself in any sort of structural sense inside of Washington. But I
Uh-huh.
think that taking part in the effort to create a political alternative, a party organization that can represent the interests of a whole wide range of people who are exploited and oppressed by the system, is worthy of the effort. I voted for the Green Party in 2016 because I
Mm-hmm.
saw the Stein Baraka ticket as the most comprehensive uh, program that represented the interests of the vast majority of people. And I wrote articles about how all of the various organizations taking part in this effort to build a political party need to actually unite on a common program in
Mm-hmm.
order to strengthen the presence of these ideas in the minds of these voters and non-voters who want things like universal health care and want things like the end of this student debt bubble, and on and on and on, police brutality, all of it. There is this opportunity, I think, to build that alternative political party, and I
Mm-hmm.
think it's going to first be broad based, and based on common class demands that then will be debated among all of us, right? How do we approach it? How do we win this? How do we win over people? These are going to be the big questions once we have this kind of social democratic movement that at least agrees upon an agenda that that meets the needs of a whole lot of poor people in this country. So I think that's a great effort. I also think that this period, the next 4 years, 2 years, 1 year, however long it takes for the system to crash, the capitalist system is going to crash again.
Yeah.
I think the next level from this focusing on the electoral system really is how do we organize workers and the unemployed again in a manner that can really challenge these wealthy capitalists and imperialists to give it up, to give up something to meet the demands of the people, or to be forced to show that they really can't, because right now it's almost just consensus that they're not, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
but people have to know that they can't in order to take that next level towards revolution. So to get us there, we need to start thinking about, well, if labor unions are being attacked and they're no longer a political force because the leadership is in the bed of the Democratic Party, we need to start thinking about how workers and poor people are going to be organized to meet their class demands. And then we have to approach the race question and racism and war. And how do we build mass organizations that do that? So we have all these different layers I think we need to attack.
What's interesting to me is can we not, maybe we can get over racism by realizing that everybody needs to unite against this, this system, these handful of rich guys, or this wealthy corporate system. I think you got to get the corporate money out of politics is the only way. As long as our representatives have to accept corporate money just to get reelected, it's all over for us. And hopefully, it will take a mass movement of people working together to somehow overcome what I can see as a corporatocracy. It's controlled by these corporations, and the voice of the people just as being completely ignored. One person just doesn't have the money to compete with a Raytheon Corporation or a Lockheed Martin,
And when Sanders was able to compete just on that level, right? Let's separate ourselves from just his political shortcomings for a second. When he was just able to compete on a level of getting labor and just single individual donations from, for the most part, working people who didn't really have anything, right? $80 here, $60 there. When he's able to compete on that monetary level from that perspective, it was the DNC that had to shut him down. And so we see that this is, I think, something that a lot of people want, right? People want independent voices. They want there is this consensus, I think, growing. And I think the challenge will be that once we have that broader program and of our agenda that we're fighting for, how do we address the particularities of the situation? How do we address the 60% of the prison population being Black? How do we address the rampant numbers of police killings that occurs in the Black community? Mm-hmm. I think all of that can be addressed in a common struggle, but it can't if we're not approaching this from a broad class oriented perspective. If we're not doing that, then we're going to either take the ball and run towards a very narrow path, or we're going to be crushed by the weight of the ruling system.
Right.
I think that's where we're going. Yeah.
So easy to get caught up. I think people have a natural tendency to want to fight with what's different than them or what the other is. And it's so easy for this divide and conquer technique to get used. But I do feel like you're talking about with Bernie Sanders, enough of all of us are waking up now that I think, we can end this conversation on a positive note, that it is possible that people can wake up and work together. We've got the numbers, there's no question about it. Definitely. And $5 a piece, $10 a piece, and we could build a pretty hardcore organization that even these large corporations won't be able to, fight. So anyway, exactly. Power to the people, right?
power to the people. Exactly.
Do you want to let people know, where they can get in touch with you or find out more of your stuff or find out more about the Black Agenda Report?
Sure. So the website has actually just been tinkered with and improved by some of our editors. You can go to blackagendareport.com. You can find me at Danny Haiphong. I publish weekly. My blog is there. You can also email me at wakeupriseUp, all one word, 1990 at gmail.com. You can also find my email and all of my articles at the end. Yeah, and so you can shoot me an email and I'll respond. That's how I get in touch with you best.
All right. Well, that sounds great. Yeah. And you have been listening to The Shift. I've been your host, Doug McKenty. If you would like to become a patron of The Shift, I'd really appreciate it. I can use all the help that I can get to keep these programs rolling out. I'm trying to do an interview a week. You can find that at patreon.com/The Shift. If you want to find out more about what's going on The Shift, join our Facebook page at The Shift with Doug McKenty. On Twitter, I am at DMcKenty. And to find out all of my archives, please check us out at www.theshiftnow.com. And thank you so much, Danny, for being on the program. And we'll keep track of what's going on at the Black Agenda Report. Thanks for your work.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good one. Take care.